Hi there. We're Open Doors Metropolitan Community Church in Seoul, Korea, and this is our YouTube channel. We're a community seeking to live out the radically inclusive love of Jesus the Christ. We're a faith community of the Progressive Christian Alliance and an emerging church of metropolitan community churches. Please join us now for excerpts from the service held on Sunday, May 1st, 2016. The sixth Sunday of Easter. This is the third sermon in the series called Pop Goes Eastertide, and the theme is, How Deep Is Your Love? Yes, we've gone from the Who in part 1 to U2 in part 2 to a syrupy disco ballad from the Bee Gees. Watch on and judge for yourself.
The first reading comes from the book of the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 11, reading the first 18 verses, as is our tradition. If we have a volunteer who'd like to read, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Now the apostles and the believers who were in Judea heard that the Gentiles had also accepted the word of God. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers criticized him, saying, "Why did you go to uncircumcised men and eat with them?" Then Peter began to explain it to them step by step, saying, "I was in the city of Joppa praying, and in a trance I saw a vision. There was something like a large sheet coming down from heaven, being lowered by its four corners, and it came close to me. As I looked at it closely, I saw four-footed animals, beasts of prey, reptiles, and birds of air. Also heard a voice saying to me, 'Get up, Peter, kill and eat.' But I replied, 'By no means, Lord, for nothing profane or unclean has ever entered my mouth.' But a second time the voice answered from heaven, 'What God has made clean, you must not call profane.' This happened 3 times. Then everything was pulled up again to heaven. At that very moment, 3 men sent from Caesarea arrived at the house where we were. The Spirit told me to go with them and not to make a distinction between them and us. These 6 brothers also accompanied me, and we entered the man's house. He told us how he had seen the angels standing in his house and saying, 'Send Joppa and bring Simon, who is called Peter. He will give you a message by which you and your entire household will be saved.' And as I began to speak, the Holy Spirit fell upon them, just as it had upon us in the beginning. And I remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said, 'John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit.' Then if God gave them the same gift that he gave us when we believed in the Lord Jesus Christ, who was I that I could hinder God?" When they heard this, they were silenced, and they praised God, saying, "Then God has given even to the Gentiles the repentance that leads to life."
The Gospel comes from the Gospel according to John, chapter 13, the 31st to the 35th verses. Just to put this in context, this is Jesus' last message, the Last Supper with his disciples before he is crucified. And this is part of what we call the farewell discourses. As you may or may not know, in the Gospel according to John, Jesus talks a lot more than he does in any of the other Gospels. He goes into these extended monologues about who he is and how he is supposed to be perceived by those who believe in him. And this comes from the farewell discourses. And the he in the first verse refers to Judas Iscariot, whom Jesus had basically just outed as the one who was going to betray him. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Thanks be to God. Continuing on our reflections in Easter, the Easter season, using the theme Pop Goes Eastertide, part 3 is How Deep Is Your Love? And this is a ballad, as I said, coming from the disco era of the Bee Gees. It was sung by the Bee Gees, and it was written by Barry Gibb here in the center, with assistance from the keyboard player in their backup band, Lou Weaver. And it was performed by the Bee Gees, of course, as part of the soundtrack to the movie Saturday Night Fever. Now, Saturday Night Fever has been imitated and have been mercilessly pilloried and satirized throughout the years. One of my favorites was actually from Saturday Night Live in 1978, and they called it Samurai Night Fever. Apparently one of the members of the SNL troupe at that time, the late John Belushi, he had this samurai character that he loved to do every once in a while. So he did. So he was doing the main character in samurai shtick. Okay, so this was quite something. Yeah, it's on YouTube. You can find it. So I highly recommend it to you. Anyway, the main character in Saturday Night Fever is a guy named Tony Manero, and he was played by John Travolta. I knew John Travolta at the time from his role as Vinnie Barbarino in a sitcom called Welcome Back, Kotter. This goes back about 40 years. Okay, I'm giving away my age, and I'm giving away my generation. But anyway, so Tony Manero, the main character in this movie, he's an American boy of Italian descent, and he has a dead-end job in a paint shop. He is overshadowed by his priest brother, okay, who the family idolizes and says, "Oh, how wonderful that your brother Frank Jr. is a priest. Why can't you be like him?" He's looked down upon by his father. He's chased around by a girl in his neighborhood named Annette, who is his dance partner. She wants to be much more than that to him, but he's not interested in that. And he has a bunch of basically other Italian-American hoodlums for friends. And together they negotiate the racial tensions in his Brooklyn neighborhood. And Tony's only form of release is Saturday night, when he can be king of the dance floor at his local discotheque, Odyssey 2001. And then Stephanie enters his life and enters the dance floor. Now he pursues her, and he endures her standoffishness and her tendency to exaggerate the details of her life. She claims to be an assistant for all these famous rock stars and claims about how she's met Eric Clapton and David Bowie, whom she mispronounces his name as Bowie. But he deals with all that, and he convinces her to be his dance partner for an upcoming dance contest. However, in one Saturday night, everything comes apart. Because his priest brother, Frank Jr., leaves the priesthood and leaves home. He and Stephanie at the dance contest, they dance well and they receive the first prize. But for Tony, it's an empty victory because he knows that there was a Latino company, a Latino couple that danced better than them. And he could see that the rewarding of the first prize to him and Stephanie was racially motivated. It's such an empty victory for him that he goes over to that couple and says, "Here, you won it fair and square. Here's the trophy, here's the prize money." Stephanie hates him for this, and in the car she castigates him for doing this and puts him down yet again. And she knees him in the groin when he tries to have his way with her. Meanwhile, Tony's friends have drugged up Annette and have embarked on what we might call a gangbang, for lack of a better term, which goes terribly wrong. They stop at the famous Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, which goes from Manhattan to Brooklyn. A place where throughout their lives they used to go after dancing on Saturday night and take part in various kinds of hijinks, doing handstands on the ledge of the bridge, pretending to fall down off the bridge, but they actually fall down to a platform below. So they're getting on. His friends are getting on with these hijinks as usual. Tony doesn't want to have very much of it because his night, he's just writing it off as a loss. And then Bobby C., the youngest member of his group, distraught because he didn't feel like Tony was paying attention to him in his moment of need. Because Bobby C. was dealing with the dilemma of having a pregnant girlfriend. In the midst of all this, he slips off the bridge and falls to his death. It all becomes too much for him. And he leaves his friends and takes an all-night ride on the New York Metro. I apologize if it seems a little heteronormative, but I do have a point to this. Now, this video is not really a part of the original movie. It was put together by a fan of the movie. But as I looked at those images, I thought I saw the process of Tony looking at his life. And as I saw that, I started to make a connection with what was happening in the Acts lesson. And as I said, that's why these hops on titles keep coming into my mind. And I thought, there's something here. I gotta explore this. I gotta stick with this. I gotta see what this is made up of. Now, I need to tell you that we have to take the portrayal of events in the early Jesus movement in the Acts of the Apostles with a grain of salt. Because if you go back to the first verse of the first chapter of Luke's Gospel, you will see that Luke actually has an agenda. He says that he wants to bring a very orderly account. He wants to write an orderly account of the things that have happened among us. And he's very obvious about that. And therefore, as people have researched the New Testament throughout the centuries, they've begun to discover that Luke's portrayal is so obsessed with this order and everything's being nice and tidy and all that kind of stuff, that there are parts which may not really correspond to what really happened in history. And if you don't believe me, compare how Luke talks about the inclusion of Gentiles into the community of the Jesus movement. Compare that portrayal with Paul's letter to the Galatians. And I guarantee you, you will see two very different models, two very different portrayals of how this happened. In spite of this, though, I think there's a great deal of value and a great deal of challenge in the lesson for today in Peter's vision. Now, it's something this vision is something that Peter, a good Jew at the time, as all the early people in the Jesus movement were, they were all good, observant Jewish people. This is a picture that Peter could never imagine. A picture of every animal and sea creature and bird and beast that there could ever be, including every possible bottom feeder and every possible animal that would violate kosher law. Then he hears a voice that says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter's response, "God forbid!" And the divine answer, in effect, comes back and says, "Don't you dare to get off telling me what's clean or unclean." And so the challenge to Peter is, in effect, to borrow the words of the schlocky disco ballad, how deep is your love? Is it deep enough to embrace all of God's creatures, all of the people whom God calls, even if they're not in your group, even if they don't follow your laws and regulations, even if they don't share your heritage, even if they don't fit your vision of what is right and what is proper and even what's moral? Remember, the thing is that shocked the Jerusalem believers at the time, as it's portrayed here in this lesson from Acts. It's not the fact that Peter took part in the conversion of Gentiles. The shocking thing was that he shared table fellowship with them. He ate with them. He associated with them without making them go through all the rigmarole of becoming Jewish first. That was the shocking thing. And we've already had a hint of this. Remember, Nathaniel, 2 weeks ago, in the lesson we heard there, said, God forbid that I should go to Saul, who is our chosen enemy. And the response is, okay, Nathaniel, don't you dare go telling me who the enemy is. From now on, you're going to call him family. And even though we now believe that Luke and Acts, we believe that they're actually a 2-volume work, that they belong together. We think they were written by the same author. Even though Luke Acts came actually about a decade before John's Gospel, I find that these 2 lessons today mesh really well together. We hear the new commandment from Jesus, love one another just as I have loved you, so you should love one another. And then in the Acts lesson, we get a vision of what this love is supposed to look like. We need to remember, though, that Jesus' new commandment given to his disciples, or as one preacher called it one time, and I like this idea, the new mandate. And the new mandate, he explained it from the Latin translation of this passage from John 13. In the Latin translation, they use the word mandatum, where we get the word mandate from. So this new mandate to love each other, we need to remember the context in which it happens. As I told you before, just before the beginning of this reading that we heard, Jesus basically outed the one who was going to betray him, Judas Iscariot. And even before that, Jesus shocked his disciples through the act of washing his feet. Now, he is the one who is going to be glorified, but at his last meal with the disciples, he takes the role of a slave, a servant. It was slaves who did that kind of thing in Roman households of the time. And then, after he tips the hand of the one who betrays him and says, go do quickly what you have to do, he has to hold up a mirror to Peter's face and say, before this night is over, you're going to betray me. So this is not an effortless, shiny, happy people holding hands kind of love. We should not interpret it as such. Yet, when we hear these words, love one another, we hear these, they're so familiar to us that we glibly misunderstand them, and we think it's just, oh, love one another, everyone's going to be happy, and everyone's going to get along. And it doesn't always happen like that. There are those who think that love is an easy thing, and that whenever difficult times come, or whenever hard things need to be confronted in the community, it becomes too much for them. I remember, and I've told you this story before possibly, I remember a person who used to be part of the Facebook group of the Progressive Christian Alliance, one of the communities that we're associated with. He talked about how uncompassionate we were because we were willing to confront, and I was one of the people who was leading this, because we were willing to confront a person in that group who was clearly expressing anti-LGBT attitudes. This person was using, this person whom we were confronting was using words like unnatural urges and trying to resist these unnatural urges. And we were saying, buddy, do you really belong in this group? And then this third person came along and said, you're not being compassionate. And this person eventually left the group and cited things like the Charter of Compassion, which which has been signed by people like the Dalai Lama and Karen Armstrong, the British author on religion, and saying, you people are not being compassionate and therefore I will not be part of this group anymore. You go do whatever you want. And that was a very hard thing to have to deal with. However, there are examples in our world of those who do know the way of love. And as I was doing some research on this for examples of that, I came across the example of Eva Kor. She is a survivor of Auschwitz, and she and her twin sister were among many of the children who were victims of the medical experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele. Dr. Joseph Mengele was known as the Angel of Death in Auschwitz, and one of the things that we now know that he did was that he picked out twin children from those who were brought into Auschwitz because he wanted to experiment upon them to see how twins would react to his so-called medical experiments, like exposing them to virulent strains of bacteria to see whether they died or not, whether one twin died before another. Now in 1995, Eva Kor went to Auschwitz with a number of other, and her twin sister, went to Auschwitz with a number of other survivors. And Eva took the step of reading a statement in which she offered her personal amnesty to Dr. Joseph Mengele and to all Nazis. Now, there were many people, including other survivors of the Holocaust, who said to her, you have no business doing this. This is improper. You are dishonoring those who have survived and those who have died in the Holocaust by offering your personal forgiveness. This is the wrong thing to do. But it's important to note, she has been a leader in the Holocaust survivors movement. She founded a group called Candle, which was specifically put together to help find and locate and support other child survivors of the Nazi death experimentation in camps like Auschwitz. And she also actively seeks reconciliation with her former captors. One of the greatest examples of this was at the trial of the German person who was found to be the bookkeeper at Auschwitz. She sought him out, and she actually talked to him, and she thanked him for his testimony. And she's explained why she does this. She's explained about why she feels it's important to talk to her captors like this. Because it allows her to counter the Holocaust deniers and the anti-Semites and all those people who want to deny the reality of the Holocaust, and she can take the testimony of these former captors, hold it up to them and say, look, these are not lies. These things actually happened. I was part of them. And more importantly, these people are willing to say they were part of this experience. It's not a lie. It's all true. Ultimately, she realized that she had to take this road of reconciliation because she recognized, she realized within herself that she could not have peace. She could not work for other Holocaust survivors unless she took this journey to reconciliation. Now, some of you may disagree with Eva Kor's actions. Some of you may disagree with me in what I'm about to say. But I find in Eva Kor's actions an example of the principles preached by a person none other than Martin Luther King Jr. in his sermon, Loving Your Enemies. And in that sermon he preached, Jesus says, love your enemy. He does not say, like your enemy. Like is a sentimental something. Love is greater than like. Love is an understanding, redemptive goodwill for all. I like that phrase, an understanding, redemptive goodwill. The New Testament scholar William Barclay called it invincible goodwill. In seeking reconciliation with her captors, Eva Kor took a radically new path, an unprecedented one, for which some have condemned her. But ultimately, this has brought peace in her life and has energized her to work for good. And so, what happened to Tony Manero at the end of his subway ride? At the end of his subway ride, he finds Stephanie's apartment and talks to her. He tells her that he's tired of his life in Brooklyn and is going to get his own place. And then Stephanie asks him if he thinks they can be friends. And he asks him, could you stand being friends with a girl? He thinks about it and answers, I don't know. I could try, Stephanie. That's all I could say. I could try. And as you can see, for her that was enough. And for Tony, that was enough. For a new beginning. And so, may we find love that is deep enough, that we can reach out for something new, something better, something greater than before. And who knows? We may be surprised by what happens. So 2 questions for you today. going back from my message in my announcement for Sunday, has there been a time when you've had to look at the world or yourself or your or others in a new light, much like Tony had to do, much like Peter had to do? And the second one, going to the gospel, what are the challenges in loving each other?
Well, I hope we haven't stretched the barriers of believability for you today. Nonetheless, we invite you to participate. All are welcome to join us in our worship and our ministry. Age, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, ethnicity, ability, and economic status are not barriers to being part of this ministry. All of the above are what we mean when we say all. We worship at 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings in the Haebangchon district in Seoul. For more information about us, our location, and our ministry activities, please check our website at www.opendooorskorea.org. We hope to see you soon.